Hey everybody, how's it going? So this is a new one here at the channel, which is going to be really exciting. If you're actually watching it on YouTube, you'll be checking it out in segments. Each discussion segment and the pitch segment will be its own separate upload. And then if you're watching it, or I guess listening to it on platforms such as Spotify, SoundCloud, and iTunes, it should just be one long audio track, but with probably time markers listed in the description for your convenience. And today I am joined by Brandon Katz from The Observer, formerly known as the New York Observer. And you can find him on social media platforms like Twitter with the username great_Katzby, which I think is hilarious. But yeah, Brandon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. I'm excited to talk a little entertainment.
Yeah, we've been kind of trying to do this forever, so I'm happy to finally be able to pull the trigger on it today. But yes, so our topics today, if I didn't already mention it, the first one, we're talking about the sequel trilogy for Star Wars, kind of the legacy of that going forward, since hopefully for when you guys are listening to this, it will be the release weekend of Star Wars: The Rise of Skywalker, technically cementing the final part of the Skywalker trilogy. And then after that, our next segment, we're talking about toxic fandoms here today, which some people may or may not connect to things like Star Wars or the DC films or even the Marvel films, really, considering how ravenous that fan base could be. And then we're going to be transitioning to something I'm personally really interested in talking with Brandon about, which is the streaming wars, which seemingly is just at the beginning of what may be a very long era of subscriptions coming out of my wallet. Ending it off, our pitch segment is basically acting as if Lucasfilm goes to either one of us and basically says, look, the Skywalker saga is over. We need a new face, a new trilogy for this Star Wars franchise. Pitch it. So getting on to the first one, the Star Wars sequel trilogy. So I'll actually let you start off with this one, your thoughts, and if it even affects the legacy of Star Wars as a franchise. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start off by saying this, Josh. The legacy of the sequel trilogy and its ultimate impact on the legacy of Star Wars won't be etched in stone for some time. These things develop over a period of time. I mean, you look back at The Empire Strikes Back, it was considered a risky swing at the time of its release, but now it's obviously gone on to be regarded as the pinnacle of the Star Wars franchise. Legacies take time to build. But one of the unexpected positives of the sequel trilogy is the fact that the new generation of characters have been so embraced over the course of these three movies. And that's a really great thing because passing the torch to a new generation of heroes and villains was necessary for Star Wars to appeal to a new group of fans and for it to move forward in storytelling and not just focus on the same exact people over and over. Now, while not perfect and certainly associated with the rise of toxic fandom, I believe the sequel trilogy will be ultimately remembered as fun and expansive, though not necessarily epic cinematic chapters in America's most beloved film franchise. You can point to each Star Wars movie in the whole entire franchise and point out flaws and things you don't like and things they could have done better. And of course, that applies to The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, and The Rise of Skywalker. But ultimately, as we look back on this 5-10 years from now, you're going to see blockbusters that change the course of franchise cinema, especially The Force Awakens with its box office totals. Yes, they certainly drummed up a fair amount of controversy, but overall, people enjoyed them well enough to conclude the Star Wars franchise on a relative high note and really signal a new chapter in cinematic storytelling for Disney.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it really well with just that one part of it where you say basically legacies aren't made overnight. And, you know, I have a similar feeling on it. I think it's going to be hard to really digest the legacy of the sequel trilogy, especially its impact on the greater franchise. Because look at the prequel trilogy. I have never seen more people than maybe like the past year or so for sure, but like the past 3-4 years say so many positive things about it. I mean, I feel like when the sequel trilogy first came out, not sequel, but the prequels first came out, I mean, Jar Jar Binks wasn't really that inspirational for a lot of people, even though I did love that theory where he was originally supposed to be the Phantom Menace, and that's why he was basically the polar opposite of Yoda in every single way. But yeah, I mean, people hated it. People destroyed Attack of the Clones. And even Revenge of the Sith, I remember people liking it more at the moment, but still overall saying how much it was terrible compared to the original trilogy and this and that. And now, yeah, the legacy of that seems to be, well, it's not too bad, and all that good stuff. I mean, with the sequel trilogy, I think it sucks it comes out in the era of social media, because unfortunately the negative voices are just a little bit louder most times than the positive. But I mean, I think the legacy of it's just going to be, in my personal opinion, not anything, to be honest, not anything heavy, at least, because to be quite honest, it didn't really do that much at the end of the day to really leave a strongly defined legacy, I don't think, if I'm thinking about how it would change Star Wars.
I like what you said, Josh, about the sequel trilogy coming out in the age of social media, because what would have happened if the original trilogy, the prequel trilogy, if they came out in the era of Twitter? I mean, we'd probably have a radically different pop culture perception of these movies had every single person and critic had a platform to nitpick, praise, critique, yell, shout, argue. So when you say
don't
that,
even forget
very
leak.
good point. Yeah, absolutely.
Like, imagine Empire Strike Back, or sorry, The Empire Strikes Back. Yeah, I say it all dramatic like sometimes, but like, imagine that movie with that twist with Darth Vader really being Anakin and all that stuff, that being leaked out months, maybe a year in advance. That's just like, that would be unheard of at the time. That would probably, you'd probably have so much uproar. Everyone like, no, Luke's father's a Jedi Knight, this and that. Yeah, I mean, the age of social media is something else.
It's to unite a fan base today with social media than it was during the release of the other films. And while The Last Jedi, the people who hated it will always hate it, and there probably won't be a kind of crossover, like you said, with the prequels where the opinions change, I do think, despite the polarizing nature of the sequel trilogy, ultimately people will consider them, vanilla comfort food overall.
Well, yeah, I mean, speaking of the legacy of the sequel trilogy especially versus the other films, one thing I think, surprisingly, and a lot of people may disagree with me at the moment, but maybe give us more time to digest and change your mind, I think the legacy will literally be built upon The Last Jedi. Because from what I can really gather, The Last Jedi is really the only film that experimented beyond, like, legacy-wise, that really experimented and changed things more so than like the original trilogy or the prequel trilogy did. Because basically The Force Awakens and The Rise of Skywalker, I'm not going to get too spoilerific for those listening to this and not yet seeing The Rise of Skywalker, but JJ didn't really reinvent the wheel. You know what I mean? Like, he kind of repainted it a little bit 9 times out of 10, especially with The Force Awakens, in my opinion. I mean, there's not much to leave a legacy with when you're basically doing the same thing. I do have to give props to Rian Johnson for The Last Jedi, because if you want to leave a legacy, you gotta be different. You gotta change things up.
Here's my thoughts on The Last Jedi, which of course has been covered so thoroughly over the last 2 years, so I won't get too deep into it. But I will say, in my opinion, that its highs are higher than The Force Awakens, and its lows are lower. I love what Rian Johnson did with Luke, Rey, and Kylo. I love his deconstruction of the Jedi mythos to kind of free up the franchise to go into new directions and move away from institutions that the franchise had grown beyond. But I also think it's an inconsistent movie quality-wise in that The Force Awakens maybe gives a smoother ride. So it really depends on what you're looking for. Do you want the heavier thematic weight, even if that comes in an uneven package, or are you just looking for a more consistently solid but perhaps not as ambitious and bold final product? It's up to the fan on what you want out of these Star Wars movies, and no one can tell you what's right or wrong in that regard.
No, exactly. I mean, it's all at the end of the day subjective. Every review's an opinion when you boil it down. It always kills me when people like freak out about reviews like oh God, Jeremy Johns made a review of, The Rise of Skywalker, and he was trending on Twitter and people were acting like he was saying blasphemy. And I'm like, well, I mean, it's just his opinion. When I just think about the legacy of the sequel trilogy, the one kind of question that keeps coming to mind, and I'm really curious your thoughts about this, is what was the purpose?
You know what I mean? The purpose of Disney was to make money. I can tell you that.
Yeah.
So guaranteed 100% factual confidence.
Yeah, because that's what I keep thinking of. It's like when I'm thinking about the legacy of the sequel trilogy, I'm like, what is it? What was the purpose of the sequel trilogy? What story was it trying to tell me? Like I haven't already seen. In the context of Star Wars at least, and then obviously with legacy, like what impact is it leaving? Basically, everyone's dead more or less from the original trilogy, and like all of those main characters are gone at this point. They're just older, so it's like what is Lucasfilm besides the money going for? And that's something I really struggle with. Outside the Last Jedi kind of, it made some points here and there which made you kind of rethink about certain things. Like you kind of touched upon it by deconstructing certain things about the Jedi and stuff like that. And it's critiques I think a lot of people have had, especially after Revenge of the Sith, and how they kind of were so stuck in their ways, so to speak, and not really open. Unlike certain characters like Qui-Gon Jinn and Mace Windu to a certain extent, they weren't really open to hearing other sides of the aisle regarding the Force. But when I just think about the legacy of the sequel trilogy, and maybe even greater than that, how it may affect the Star Wars franchise as a whole legacy, I can't say anything positive with regards to a commercial sense, because everything I think of is kind of like a downward spiral almost of like fan reception, and I mean everyone basically saying the grass was greener on Legends and all that stuff. Brandon, thanks for joining me today. It's been great. Feel free to follow Brandon on Twitter at great_Gatsby. And yeah, well, I guess I'll just leave it off to you really quick to say any final thoughts.
I just want to thank you for having me on, Josh. It was a whole lot of fun. And for everyone listening, just keep loving entertainment.
For those listening on YouTube, feel free to subscribe, comment, like, share the video. And if you're on a platform like SoundCloud, iTunes, or Spotify, thanks for listening on those. I know it's probably a very long listen at this point. Hopefully it fit well with your commute to work or from work to home. And give it a share if you like, a little heart like on SoundCloud, and follow us, add us to your favorites on iTunes and Spotify, and we'll see you guys later.